So good morning, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for coming. We have loads of slides and happy to jump around, talk through things. The tiny URL is the link to this slide deck. I have a real challenge of putting way too much information in the slide deck, but also in the hopes of if questions come up, we can kind of jump around to move around to make it worthwhile. So I'm Nat Vaughn. I'm the middle school principal in Medfield, Massachusetts. We'll talk a little bit about Medfield, grade 6 through 8 middle school in Medfield.
And I'm Orla Berry. I'm the science department chair for grade 6 to 12, so the middle school and the high school in Medfield.
And we'll give you a sense of, our hope is to talk about meaningful feedback and specifically talk about the transition, the work we've been doing at the middle school for the last 6 to 7 years, and really in some ways going back 15, 16 years, to shift away from traditional grades at our middle school. So to give a sense, and Erin Carney, who's one of our math teachers, unfortunately, one of her children got the stomach bug yesterday, so she's not able to make it. But you'll see some of the slides within as we go through. Our Twitter handles are here. We are happy to connect at all times, and we'll talk about things that are going well, things that are not going well, and all the way through on the process that we've gone through to give an overview. And Orla, just jump in all over the place as always. So this is hopefully what we'll talk a little bit about is philosophy. How did we get there? Some of the structures that we've put in place. Motivation on two levels, motivation of the adults within the community, but also I would say one of the hot issues is always, grades are what motivate kids. And what the research says, but also what we've found and what that works is current research and trends that we're continually learning about and sort of our next steps and where we're at, which is we're really in an interesting spot right now as a school. We can talk about that a little bit too, and as a district. So to give you a sense of Medfield, if you're not familiar with Medfield, it's right outside, right near Framingham, Wellesley, Metro West community, upper middle class community, a lot of people that look like me. We are not diverse by race, we're not diverse by ethnicity, by religion very much. We are very diverse in learning though, and that's the piece from that. Or anything else to say about the community?
No, I mean it's a very homogeneous community. Yeah. And our sort of way of doing school is very traditional for the most part, systemically, if you look at it from a system point of view. And
I would say Medfield's an interesting community. It's an affluent community, getting more and more affluent. What we're finding is our diversity is actually increasing at a very incremental rate. Come on in. To give you a perspective, about 7 or 8 years ago, within the district, we had 2 ELL students in the district. Right now, we're probably close to 45, which still is not a huge number, but incremental growth over 6 years, and that's something that we're really adapting. The learning range has really widened. We're also finding within the community, it's not that the numbers we're becoming more economically diverse in a lot of ways. Socioeconomically, what we're finding is the gap is just getting more disparate. So that idea of rich getting richer, and then we have a significant equity issue in our district that we've been cited on. We were very actually pleased to be cited on because it forced us to do some action through our coordinator program review. So that just gives a glimpse of what we're trying to get at a little bit. I would say the Royal We at Blake, are a big fan of our mission statement, and we rewrote our mission. And so that's the one thing I would say from the start, and Sean talked about that a lot, vision and mission. You got to start there. If you do not have a well-defined mission, it's very hard to center the work through all of this. So we really centered on our mission a lot. We talk about it a lot as a living mission statement, share with the community a lot. That is not just about students, about the community, about the parents. And the mantra that we really talk about is the willingness to adapt. It is really important. We also rewrote and really did a lot of work on our school council and our school improvement plan. So our 3 goals really touch on these 3 things. You'll see nowhere in our school improvement plan goals are any specific devices, any specific learning strategies. Because our goals really shouldn't change all that much. How we get to the goals should. So the 3 overarching goals with the overall question, our essential question is cultivating and curating the progression of student learning and growth. So just some exercises we did as a staff. So I firmly believe that idea that we have to really root everything in theory and in research, and really talk a lot about philosophy, because that's going to inform our practices, inform our beliefs. So these are Wordles. I'm sure you've seen different aspects. These are ones that we did as a staff 4 years, each year at the start of the year, different questions. Try to start the year with themes. the beginning, this is probably 5 or 6 years ago, we talked about who are we as a Blake staff? What are the attributes we want to be? These are the words that popped up. Who do we want our students to be? So these two questions that we talked a lot about, that came from our staff, we talk a lot about mirror moments for our staff. So let's hold up a mirror. If these are the attributes we want in our students, do we give feedback on any of those aspects formally to our students? We asked it of families as well. Who do you want your kids to be when they leave Blake Middle School? What do you want their attributes to be? Curious, empathic, accepting, collaborative, kind, independent, creative. None of those we gave formal feedback on to kids. None. And that was a huge mirror moment of we've got a problem. We've got a real disconnect that we're talking about, belief and practice. We need to look at that. Then we asked kids, students, families, and staff, what helps you learn? Mirror moment. If all those things help us learn, how often are we actually providing those experiences? And if we know that, where's the disconnect? And then how can we empower our students? And we ask students that way, staff, families as well. So that's a way that we engage in the community to kind of ground our work. I think everyone agrees to this, and then when we get into practice, we often forget it. And we have a lot of yeah buts. But we need to keep coming back to this. So slides are just a piece that I would recommend. And it does become a broken record, but we need to be a broken record about these things. These slides that I'm showing are at the start of every faculty meeting, every professional development. Every time, we may not spend time on it, but they're there. We'll just make sure that we touch point as we go through. Anything I'm missing, Orla?
I would have mentioned the fact that once a week you send out the question of the week to students. Yeah. So it's not that this is a one and done kind of thing that Nat does at the beginning of the year. Every week when he sends out his blog, his principal's blog and curriculum updates and so on, he asks the students, a variety of different questions about how they learn, what they need to learn. So I think it's a continual effort to empower students and to provide them an opportunity to share their voice and share their concerns and so on.
So this is a slide that creates a lot of angst for some. And what it is it's showing sort of that we have to talk about everything all the time. That it's very hard, and I think what's really hard that I find, I remember feeling this way as a teacher, is can't we just focus on one thing this year? Like this is just too much. Can't we just why aren't we just talking about SEL or just about homework? So the idea was this, and one of the parents on our school council helped create this visual, was the top 5 are our strategic plan goals as a district. So there's 5 subcategories. The middle 3 are our 3 goals from our school improvement plan. All these are all the different things that we talk about as a community. And what the idea of the visual is to remind and to hold up a mirror of, we can't talk about any of these in isolation. So it's that idea of either the spinning plates or keeping all the balls in the air. And for a number of reasons is, how can you talk about calibration of practices if you're not talking about meaningful feedback? Well, how do we talk about feedback if we're also not talking about student social emotional learning? Well, social emotional learning ties to equity. Well, to get to equity, we need differentiated instruction. I think you get the point. The idea is, it's just to hold up is, we can't just talk about that. The other piece is knowing that staff are in very different places. Some staff might be really needing to focus on this. Others may need to be focused on differentiated instruction. So if we're giving choice into professional development, we've really adopted a lot of an ed camp model with a lot of our PD. So it's kind of mirror that we need to really be thinking about all these different things at once as we go through. So this is one that's, we talk a lot about messy, and it's a piece that word becomes, we've tried to embrace that as a staff. Learning is messy. If we're not making it messy, we're not going to learn as we go through. And this is just a piece that kind of talk about, I would say, feedback. If we gave, John Doria often talks about truth serum. If you gave it to your staffing community, what would they say about you? I would say a knock on me that people would say is too much theory, Nat, too much ed research, too much philosophy. And okay, feedback, fair, listen to it. The thing is, if we're not being current and talking about theory impacts our belief systems impact practices. So an example I always talk about, if our math teachers don't truly believe that all kids can learn, that's going to change how they respond when a kid doesn't get the right answer. It just is. So we need to get to that idea of having a shared belief system. We have to kind of remind people, this is why we're doing that. Also try to remind, in any other profession, we would fire the people or go to a different practice if they weren't current. If our doctors were still going on research from 25 years ago, we joke about, well, are we going to have our doctor? If we went to a doctor's office and had a jar of leeches on the shelf, I think we'd be pretty freaked out, right? But there's a lot of practices, like tried and true. Our lawyers, they better be up to date on the laws. Our accountants, if they're not up to date, well then we've got a problem. We should probably change who's doing our taxes. So thinking about that, what we ask of others, we need to ask of ourselves as well. And thinking too with our teachers, if we really if you want to negotiate a better contract, we got to make sure that we're being professional learners all the time. We would want that. So we have to just talk a lot about theory as we go through. I put this back in, Orla.
Oh.
Orla's always like, Nat, too many slides. Ted Sizer, I just adore. And this goes back to that messy slide. I think this comes true all the time. And Orla and I talked the whole ride here of like, we just got to blow up the system, right? The small system, the big system, everything. But I think it's something to come back to that is affirming too. So just something as an exercise, always talk about with parents and kids. And I would ask you just to do this too. When was the last time you received effective feedback? What did it look like? What made it effective? So when we started to adjust to the new eval system 6 years ago or so within the state, all the evaluators in our district, we talked a lot about calibration of practices with evaluators. And we did a lot of work with Dave Castelline, who came from Teachers 21. And he did an exercise of all of the evaluators in the district, about 30 of us in the room, and had us write down when was the last time you received effective feedback and what did it look like, and just write about it. To a person, the feedback was in person and it was actionable about 1 to 2 steps, and then there was a follow-up in writing. To a person, there was none of it. No one talked about letter grades. No one talked about, so that was a piece for us about thinking about, well, if that's true, we got to think about that for our students. So really thinking in that way. Parents, this resonates too, a great deal. So when parents start to give feedback about, well, this isn't the real world, this isn't the real world. Well, let's talk about your real world and work. How do you receive feedback? Most of them talk about a face-to-face conversation in that way. So I think really mirroring that, trying to beat that fallacy of the quote real world, that I think is a narrative that we come in. Anything, Orla? Okay. So Rick Wormeli, just have to always add some quotes from him. This is a piece too of the idea is like, what's the purpose of grades? Whether we call it standards-based reporting, we want to call it competency-based, all these things, all it is just feedback. That's it. Just communication. Let's not put a value on bigger than what it is. It's supposed to also help kids learn. That's it. That's the idea. So a big picture thing that we've also learned as a staff as we go through that hopefully we'll get to in the time frame is to talk about that. It was really ironic is as a staff, we probably have about 75 staff total. I think one person on our staff had formal professional development in their work about assessment and learning, which was fascinating, myself included. I never learned how to do assessment. I never learned how to grade. I think about first time becoming a math teacher, I thought I was a pretty bright person. I was like, I don't know, 25%, 30%, I'll do retakes. We never talked about the theory behind assessment and learning. So we had to do that and do a lot of education in that way. I'm gonna kind of pull away the curtains. Not gonna show it. Always important to show families, staff, parents the origin of grades. Always important. It's a hyperlink to it. It's a quick link. It'll be nothing that you haven't heard and seen, but it's real tangible to go about why we had grades. I'm listening a lot to the Modern Learners podcast right now, just to remind people the 3 structures that schools were founded on: churches, prisons, and factories. It makes sense as to why. We've learned a lot more about the brain in science and research, but really it makes sense. Mass production. That's what schools were founded on. We know a lot more about the brain now, so we need to go about that. We always say we have to lean on science. I mean, that's Orla's baby as the science department chair. We need to lean on science, and we need to do that as educators. We have a responsibility. Again, just Todd Rose's work. If you haven't checked out Todd Rose's work, The End of Average, phenomenal TED Talk, great book, very accessible, very, very accessible for everyone. It's not ed theory-ish. So if you haven't checked out Todd Rose, check it out. Some great podcasts with him, and his TED Talk is phenomenal, called The End of Average. So this is just things to think about, too, some philosophy questions. Why do we come to school? We ask kids every day. What do you think they say right away? To do what?
See my friends.
Learn? Well, yeah, okay, see my friends, but like, purpose, you're right, totally, absolutely, right? And we have to remember that, too. What's the purpose of school? Why do you come to school? To learn. We also say that to teachers. What's the thing that we spend the most time talking about that we're frustrated about in school? Grades. Most communication with parents is grades. When we're interviewing staff, if I say, so why did you become a teacher? And the person says, well, I want to grade kids. that would be, well, okay, we're doing screening interviews, like kind of 2 questions and we'll move along. Everyone talks about, I want to make an impact. So let's remember that. We never got into to grade kids, yet the irony is that's all we talk about. We need to shift that focus to really talk about learning all the time and what we know about learning. And then we ask, what's the most authentic way to assess students? What should constitute a student's grade? As we know, it's completely random. It's a game of Monopoly. We made it up. We make it up every day, and we're always doing it all the time. And we just have to acknowledge that. And then how do we know if students are learning in our classrooms? Have to ask these questions all the time. All the time we have to keep coming back to them.
And I think a lot of this work, really what it did was it shifted our perspective as teachers too in the classroom away from, and we'll say for myself as an evaluator as well as a teacher, away from focusing on the teaching and more focusing on what are the kids doing. It was sort of like Sean was talking about in that first pilot or whatever it was, that they had all these kids collaborating in the room until they actually investigated and realized, not so much. It looked like they were collaborating. So I know as an evaluator, I spend a lot more time interacting with the kids in the classroom, and sort of I think then personally and across the board in our department, the shift has become, what does it mean for kids even to learn? So because we've sort of started digging deep into our standards, into this whole idea of, what makes up a grade and everything else, we've really shifted that focus into the learning itself and the science of learning.
So a tangible piece, if you haven't done it, run grade distribution reports in your school. Run grade distribution reports, share them with the staff. Share them. I started doing that when I became a principal in 2005, and that's really what started getting into the work was, and part of it was a curiosity. I became an assistant principal in the school that I was teaching in. So I had all these preconceived notions of my colleagues. And so part of it was, I wanted to look at it, but I was also a little gossipy. Wanted to kind of look, I heard this teacher. So I ran reports. How random it was in reality was fascinating. Teachers that were known as the tough grader had 95% A's in the class. Teachers known as easy graders had, C range. We had discrepancies. We're middle school. Okay, so we always say to parents, doesn't matter what cluster you're on, they're all, it's all good. We know that's not true, right? In reality, it doesn't always come out that way. We had discrepancies of up to 54% discrepancy. Cluster A, one group of students, 91% A's, another cluster, 17% A's. Middle school, heterogeneously grouped. I would venture to say you may not have that wide a gap, but if you run your reports in your schools, you'll find major gaps. I would be very surprised if you didn't. We shared that data with our staff, and you have to. What was fascinating was you realize how many people don't even think about it. We had teachers that weren't sure whether they were the teacher that had 55% A's or 20% A's. That was kind of scary. So you're not sure from your gut instinct whether half of your kids or 1 out of 5 kids are in that grade range. Speaks to a lot of the randomness. So that kind of helped push that envelope of what we're doing in that way. Just to note, a reasonable discrepancy is about 10%. We had our BC Calc teacher at the high school, Mike Kramer, run reports for us. That's a reasonable discrepancy of the sample size of 80 to 100 kids. Okay? I'll also name this work is a hell of a lot easier to do at a middle school than a high school. Hell of a lot easier. Hell of a lot easier to do at elementary than middle. As they get older, we get all those fears of college. 6th graders are talking about college in our classes. That's where their goals are in advisory. So we have to recognize that, and that's a community that Medfield is. We came to the district for the schools. What do you mean you're not going to give grades? My kid may not get into an Ivy. I mean, those are conversations we have with 6th grade parents. So we have to kind of talk about that a lot as we're doing it. We do surveys of staff and students every year through our site council and our parents, and just to talk about the importance of gaining feedback. Sean talked about that a lot. And this is interesting from a student at Blake. Teachers could maybe individually talk with students during class, during interim reports, and tell us personally how we're doing any tips. Comes from students. Ask them, they give very good feedback. Hard part is how do you do a system like this and mass scale it? It's hard when you have 80 to 100 kids to give super meaningful feedback and have those conversations. So how do you operationalize it? So this is just a slide deck to kind of give some structures in place. Within this hyperlink are slide decks to different presentations that we've done to parents, teachers, students, conferences, workshops, our 6th grade students to look at it. So I'm not going to go through all this. This is kind of like Todd Rose's work, but this is slides that we do with parents. The idea of we think we know a B+, what can you tell us about these students, and then kind of demystifying it, about what it could be behind it. What's fascinating when we ask kids, what can you tell us about these 2 students? One of the kids every year says, oh, they cheated. And I was like, well, we've got an ethical problem. Like, what? I was like, what? And they said, well, how else could they have the exact same average? I was like, all right, so we've got some like social emotional work to do, I guess. But this is the idea, right? Like what we know about averages. And just kind of say like, let's talk about, I do this with sociology kids at the high school when they're doing their assessment unit. I go over there and talk to them. Test 5, what could have happened? What do you think some kids say? What could have happened on test 5 for student B? Didn't study. What else? Had bad day.
Yeah.
Issue at home. Teacher didn't teach it. Oftentimes the kids will say, dog died the night before.
Yeah.
Super real. Super, super real stuff, right? To talk about it. So then we kind of get into saying like, all right, difference, this is what drives kids berserk. When they see the real stuff, right? I remember my advice I was given as a teacher, never have a grade calculated out to a 0.4 on a barrier, right? And this is why like people hate online grades and all those stuff. It's the game of school. What do most teachers do when a kid gets this? Bump them up, okay? Random, and then we get into equity issues. Why bump there? Why not bump here? And those are the conversations like retakes. Most common retake I would say is, oh, below 70 do a retake. What about the kid that got the 70 the first time? Don't we all want all kids to learn? I thought we said that back at the beginning of the year. What about, why not 71? Why not 72? It's random, okay? And what the problem is okay to say it really doesn't matter. Boy, does it start to matter long term when you start grouping kids into ability group classes. This random decision could be the difference between Molly being recommended for a class here or there. That could have a long-term impact. So let's think about that, okay? We need to think about that and not be focused on that, but remember that it could impact a kid. So just kind of descriptions that we go through. I would also say if your district or school is not ready at all to talk about standard-based reporting, talk about language at least, okay? Language is incredibly important. Words have the biggest impact on us. So if you are not focusing on changing your vocabulary, this is not just semantics. It is very real. Trying to shift back, what did you get to what did you learn? Getting that shift, and that is a hard shift to make for all of us. It's hard for me as a parent. I have a high schooler, middle schooler, and a fourth grader. Hard for me not to, I have to practice what I preach. It's really hard because we're in that system. And I think that's something that we're hoping, Orla, to shift. Would you agree?
Yeah.
And I think that's something that we see at our high school. High schools are harder to shift. They just are. But trying to shift that away, that's kind of those baby steps along the way with that. This is also, Jennifer Gonzalez wrote this great post about the idea of feed forward versus feedback. Most of the feedback we give is just looking back. It's not helping them on the next step. And that's the thing we think about coaching. A lot of analogies with sports. What makes you better is the very next step to give. Some of the work that we've done with Nathaniel Brown from Boston College has been, we are not helping kids on the next step. We're actually giving kids way too much feedback. We're drowning them in red ink. And the analogy he gives is, and he talked about how he was overweight, went to the doctor's office. The doctor's like, you need to do this, 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 and this, new diet, you need to do this, this, and this. What happens when you get all that feedback? What do we naturally do? Shut down. Too much. Better thing is, I want you to do the elliptical 3 times a week for 20 minutes for about 4 weeks, come back and talk to me. That's doable. Now we can also assess our data point. So talking about we're drowning our kids in red ink. We should be giving them 1 to 2 pieces of feedback and that's it. And move forward to the next step. And we'll kind of talk about progress. So we're trying to shift from the idea of feedback to feed forward. Rick Wormeli talks a lot about how grades are often an autopsy. Doesn't help much. End of year narratives don't help much. It's just a summary. It's not action points moving forward. So what we're doing is this, and we started this from a conference we went to with Rick Wormeli 6 years ago. I think Marty was there. And there was a number of us who took a cross-section of staff from different disciplines, all 3 grades. Irony is one of the attendees that brought the conference to my attention is one of the biggest detractors of the program. And I'm like, do you remember this was your idea? Not your idea, but it was a big idea. But it's harder to do in reality, is separating out content standards from learning skills. Some schools call them habits of mind, habits of learning, trying to tease out whether you understand the material and then your habits of learning. And the habits of learning, what we really should concentrate more about. So this is what we're doing. I would say it's not perfect, okay? We have a 3-point scale on content standards. A lot of teachers want a 4. Parents want a 4, okay? Exceeding the standard. Now we're getting a little bit more nebulous. Also, Orla and I talk a lot about the more factors, and this is from a data perspective, we add in, it's going to be harder to calibrate. We start getting that. Also, what's the challenge of a 4-point scale? What do kids equate it to? A, B, C, D, right? Even if you're doing it philosophically different, they'll associate a 4 with an A 3 with a B. They just will, okay? A downside of a 3-point scale that I know statistically, oftentimes we just veer to the median. That's why sometimes a 4-point scale can be better. You have to kind of choose. So this is something that we're talking about, okay? Parents want an exceed standard. I'm not 100% adverse to a 4, but I really want to talk about what does it mean. You know, is it more generalizing the standard, applying it to a new environment, things like that. And this is kind of what it looks like. One thing that we've really tried, like initially in 6th grade science, our team, the teachers came from it. Well, you want to talk about that team?
Sure. So we have an amazing team in 6th grade science, probably one of the most highly functional, professional group of 6th grade teachers I've ever come across. They're really good at pushing each other, but in such a professional way that they listen, they learn from each other, they disagree plenty, but they set up a lot of norms and a lot of systems for themselves at the very beginning of this process, and I think that allowed them to do a lot of this work. So initially we set it up in terms of the very specific 2016 MASS frameworks, the STE frameworks, and we listed all the content, and this is just one little piece, but it's ridiculous. Like it's yay long. You know, I've no idea how many substandards we have, but there are a lot, no more than in English, no more than in everybody else's discipline. But this is how we sort of started at the beginning. We said, well, let's do this, let's list the standards, let's give the kids, we do 3 marking periods and then a progress report, an interim report halfway through each of the trimesters, and let's provide parents with feedback in terms of whether or not they're meeting these specific standards. Now, as you can see, if you look at these, they're not very friendly, the standards. I mean, if you're a science teacher, you read them and say, sure, no problem, I understand what that means. Although, in fairness, we, with the new standards, we had to do a lot of unpacking, I think is the term we like to use. We had to do a lot of work and say, what exactly does that look like? What do the kids really need to know to be able to use evidence to support this claim and so on? So initially we started with this, but over the last few years we've made some changes which we can describe in a minute, because we realized this wasn't as friendly as it could be to parents, and because it was just too much. It was too much information. I mean, you get to that point where you're reporting on so much that it's insane for the teachers, it's insane for the kids, and it's insane for the parents.
Absolutely. So then, you know, where does a 1, 2, or 3 come from? This was a piece that we realized when we started to look at. Now it forced us to align, were our assessments aligned to the frameworks? Because we had to actually pick it out. So this is ways to do it. What we realized a lot of times, we weren't even aligned. We thought we were. And starting to, well, I just liked that question. You know, it's a good question. It's a rich question. It's a rigorous question. It wasn't even aligned to the frameworks. We also found at the time we had 3 levels in 8th grade math. The only ability grouping we do at the middle school currently is in 7th and 8th grade math. We had 3 levels in 8th grade math. The majority of questions on our quote unquote lower level 8th grade math, questions weren't even aligned to the frameworks because in the intent of trying to make it accessible, we had watered it down, truly watered it down. They weren't being assessed the frameworks. Well, that makes sense now why we're struggling on some of our MCAS scores. So it forced us to really make things accessible.
Sorry.
No.
So this is a cover sheet. We created then cover. I say we. I didn't do any of this
teachers.
work. The teachers did all of this work. I came along for the ride and learned a ton from them.
The royal we.
Yeah, exactly. So they created cover sheets for each test, and that's what forced them then to start looking at their tests. And this is what we've noticed, and I think all the other department chairs are now saying that in the years subsequent to this, as other departments came on board, our assessments have changed. Our assessments are far more aligned to the standards than they ever were before. And just by virtue of the fact, you started to dig in and started to look at, to Nat's point, why is that question there? What's its purpose? You know, is it giving me any information with regard to the standards?
And all along, we had been working a lot on common assessments anyway. And then it was like, well, what's common? Right? That definition of common. And it's like, well, let's talk about that. A lot of people are like, well, we all teach the framework, so we have common assessments. No. So I am a very real stickler about common is the same, the exact same. Like it has to be. Otherwise, we're assessing different things. We don't know what they got wrong. We just don't. So we need to be that way. That's a hard thing. Again, easier to do at a middle school with calibrating 3 teachers is easier than calibrating 7 to 8. That's a lot harder to do. Go ahead. Yep.
Put me off.
Nope.
You talk about tests and questions. Do you have any performance tasks?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, we will get.
Jumping
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
but
and
that's
if we
perfectly
don't
fine.
get to that,
Yeah.
I would just say contact us. We have a lot of things that we're doing. Some are better than others. Some are more further along. As Orla said, this work that's hard came from 6th grade science. So at that conference on day 2, this was back in 2013, I think, one of the 6th grade science teachers said, Nat, can we pilot this? Will we make this our professional practice goal this year for 3rd term for 1 unit? Absolutely. They did 1 unit, and then they said, can we do the whole term? We're not getting enough feedback to do. We can assess the content standards, but not the learning skills. Absolutely. Then they asked if they could pilot it the following year in 6th grade science. So yeah, encouraging, picking the right kind of early adopters, but then it just kind of grew from there. Science was highly calibrated. We also were in the process of science of adopting to the next generation science standards. Tons of work, but it was a real new opportunity with curricula. 8th grade civics we're doing this year. This is their first year of doing standards-based reporting. They just blew it up all at once. It's harder to undo practices than to create practices, really. So I think that's something that we always talk about. I'm sure you do as well. I wish we could just start a school, and start a system of doing it. So looking at that. So this is kind of like how it works to that. We also had already done a ton of work prior to this about retakes, how important they are, that the goal is the end goal on learning, and that's what it is. Now we have to report if it took multiple times separately, but don't have it quote unquote penalize whether they knew it or they didn't. So that's some of the work. This is kind of level of understanding what it looks like as we go through. These are just some examples.
No, so this is where I should
Yeah,
jump
go
in,
ahead.
because this is somewhat to your point. So what we showed earlier is where we were, and this is more where we are and where we're going, insofar as we've shifted completely now, well, not completely, in 7th grade science, we shifted completely this year away from content standards, and we've gone to the science and engineering practices. So we're now essentially using power standards.
Yeah.
And as a result, we have completely reworked, we'll say, the report cards and all the systems of feedback, because we have moved into performance-based. I don't believe there's any traditional assessment that I can think of right now in 7th grade science anymore. It's all, can you build the bridge? Does the bridge actually support whatever it's supposed to support? They're making their solar cars, they're making their solar ovens, etc. And as a result, we're understanding whether or not they truly have mastered the standard in the context of what they're creating. So it's far more about they're creating products, they're presenting them to the kids. The kids have specific rubrics and tools that they use to give other students feedback, and in the whole sort of process we're learning what they can do and what they can't do and what they can actually demonstrate. So what the 7th grade science teachers did was they pulled the science and engineering practices and sort of categorized them into 3 sort of larger practices or power standards. So the skills of investigation, the skills of analytical thinking, and then the skills of evaluating and communicating. And because they've done such a wonderful job, and I'll explain the rest in a second, because they've done such a wonderful job with this, 6 and 8 we're jumping on board next year. Yeah. Because what they did was they actually set up benchmarks and said, what's this actually going to look like at the end of term 1, at the end of term 2, and at the end of term 3. So at the end of term 1, you can see for the skills of investigation, students can complete a teacher-provided investigation. You move over to the end of term 2, given a problem, students can design, and then you see at the end of term 3, independently students can drive. So you get an idea of the sort of progress. And in addition to doing this generically, kind of big picture, we're creating, the royal we again, are creating progression maps for each of the standards. So specific to your forces of motion unit, specific to your energy unit, and so on. Which I think is very helpful for the kids, because they know, oh, this is where I should be within this unit in order to make it to my 3. This is where I need to go. This is where I need to.
So we're not there as a school yet. Yeah. This is like what process doing, kind of like what are we currently working on. 7th grade science is there. 6th grade social studies has done a lot of really nice work on it, and for different reasons. As we've been doing it, this is super helpful for parents too, because if they get I'm approaching the standard on skills of analytical thinking. What does that mean? Well, this tells you where the benchmark is for them. Also, a lot of times what's hard, families think they know when their child gets a B+ what it means. They don't. We just know that. It could mean anything. They also know, really seriously, we have very high grades in Medfield. Our median at the school is an A- at Medfield High School, median. So if you're not a math person, that's okay. That means half of the students are getting above an A-. So when parents get a B+, they think, oh, they're doing so well. Well, actually, to be honest, they're below the median. They wouldn't want to hear that. And so we've done a lot of like revealing the curtain, like Wizard of Oz. Let's just tell you, because a lot of the times is, well, how are kids going to react when they go from Blake to the high school and they get a C? Well, the good news is no one's getting C's. I mean, not nobody,
Yes,
very small percentage. That's a piece. Like, how are they going to react? That's the piece, like when they get to high school. That's a big, 8th to 9th grade is a huge piece in our community right now. Are we preparing them? Are we not preparing them? So this is just kind of giving some offshoots. I'll try to go through world language. They've broken down to 3 power standards as well. Moved away to much more of a proficiency model that they were doing anyway in language, trying to get away from the grammar. Can you just communicate? That's the piece that we want to get at. So math is a huge topic too at our school, okay? A lot of parents say, well, you just can't do it in math. It makes sense in the humanities, doesn't in math. Our 8th grade math is full on board behind this. I know Wayland has been doing a ton of work with math. So that's the irony, like it depends on the culture of your school, community, and staff. We're in an interesting spot at our school. Our 8th grade math are more on board with it than 7th grade math. It's hard, because like we go 6th grade, they're on board. 7th, well, we need traditional, and then 8th grade. Those are just dynamics that you have to kind of work on as a school and try to get to that culture and just be okay with as we're going through. So this is just kind of breaking down. I'm just going to try to rifle through. This is just a math presentation that shows how it works.
And if Erin had been here, she could have explained it to you.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
I don't want to take that on.
And I think that's the thing too, is translating all the math frameworks for parents. What the hell does it mean? I mean, really, what does it mean? Orla, you and I were looking at that science experiment. We didn't even know what the math terms meant that a kid offered for a science fair.
Wants to do a science fair.
And I was a math teacher. I didn't know what it meant.
Equations. I have no
but
idea.
Trying to break down how many standards they are that we're breaking down. Tracking sheets that we're trying to give to kids on progress maps. How are you doing? And along the way so they can self-assess as they go. Sample report card in 8th grade math. These are our learning skills that we really, a lot of how we picked, not random, but we did a lot of work, a lot of based in Tony Wagner's work. About what we want. One of those words on the Wordle that was big was creativity. Really hard to assess creativity. But everyone says they want their kid to be creative. So we have to start assessing it. And that's just not glitter on a poster, okay? So we have to define creativity now. To Sean's point, do we have the same definition of innovation? Sharing that and breaking that down. We currently are giving descriptors consistently, often, sometimes, rarely. That was just really trying to work out. Now we're at, what's the difference between often and sometimes? We got to calibrate. We have to talk. We had always at the top initially. So what's the problem with that? No one is always, right? Absolute. Also, it's an A. People started making that as an A. That's not what it was. Other thing was, so the night that we were first piloting that 3rd term, we had a text thread going, like with the teachers, like, how's it going, how's it going? And one of the teachers screenshotted and said, Nat, we got a problem. I'm like, what, did a screenshot? The kids' report said ass, ass, ass. And I was like, all right, that won't be good when Nat, like, the cuddly, come to middle school, we're all gonna learn, it's safe, we're gonna do all this, and we're calling your kid a triple ass. I mean, that's not gonna mirror. So sometimes you gotta look at like what it looks like. So we actually, then I sent an email to parents saying, we're having problems with our database system, so the report's gonna be delayed for 2 days. Basically, like, we don't wanna call your kid an ass. So this is what we're doing. So this has been really interesting too. Good feedback that would mirror moments for us was saying, well, we don't have enough to assess creativity term 1, so we're going to gray it out. So a mirror moment as a school that a parent pointed out to us. You're telling us creativity is that important, and you're only focusing on 2/3 of the year. Fair point. Really fair point. All right, let's talk about that. Now we need to kind of push back and go from there. It's hard. Teachers want a finished product. It's never going to be finished. We have to iterate and go through. That we're looking at. So this is the kind of thing that we're focusing on.
I was just going to say one thing, if you want to go back to the skills, I don't know how we're for time, but within departments and then as a faculty, we worked through each one of these and sort of broke down, what does working collaboratively with peers look like in science? Maybe it looks a little different in English, maybe it looks a little different in math, so we went through that process. Now I have to say, I know for us in science, it's been at least a year, and I'm going to say maybe even a year and a half since we've had a good conversation about this, and it's time. It's really way overdue. We need to have conversations about this very regularly because you think you're on the same page, but then subsequently a couple of months later, somebody says something, somebody else says something else, and you realize, actually, we're not at all. And so we need to have these sort of calibration kind of conversations all the time.
And I say this respectfully, Justin Reich talks a lot about radical teacher autonomy, right? As a teacher, I wanted autonomy. I know what's best. I want it as a principal too. I was I'm like, Jeff, let us do what we want to do. Well, now we got to calibrate with the other schools too. Like, yeah, you're right. You know, that's hard, but we have to look at that. Homework was a big topic, still is. A lot of teachers and parents want homework as a learning skill. That's not a learning skill. Homework's way overrated too. Way overrated. The research is very clear on that. Very clear. I'm not saying that we should get rid of it, but it's way overrated in impact on learning. So that's a conversation too. Where does homework come in?
Yeah.
Does it come into standard 3 or standard 4? Departments, teachers may see that differently. We got to talk about that. Like, where is that practice? So I'll try to just go through. This is just sharing some things like that we share with parents as well. This is just to give an idea if you want to do some work. This is probably like 3 or 4 years ago, an email and outline we gave to department chairs for a structure. Where do you even begin? Kind of just give some outlines. This gives a timeline. That hyperlink in orange gives a sense to the timeline that we've done in a much better visual, how we expanded. What's hard is this shows how messy we have been evolving. It's been hard for families too, and we're not using a database for it. We use Aspen, but it's not in Aspen. It's all like Google Sheets, Google Forms. So right now as a parent, they're getting like a 7-page report. That stinks, okay? They're not even the same form. It makes sense. I can only go so long saying, hey, it's middle school, it's okay. It's hard. Like, how do you navigate it? And then collating, stapling, all that stuff. Who's doing that? Our staff is phenomenal, and then we have to push and pull and kind of be like, hey, it's good, right? We believe in it. So doing that, and this is last year, you see expanding.
Another thing that timeline shows, that if you don't need to go back in the slide, but if you click on that link and look at the timeline, what you're going to see is, and Nat won't like me saying this, but the persistence. You have to have somebody like Nat leading this, who's dogged in their determination to, move the thinking in a school. So if you look at that timeline, you're going to see Padlets that were sent out, surveys that were sent out, emails. It's all linked in there, and you get a sense of it's the only way to shift a culture is to keep at it.
And I would say from design. I wish Aaron was here because it's like I recognize like the authority of the principal. You need to have that voice. It's not going to happen if I'm just speaking though. Our department chairs are critical because they're the ones that are making it work. We also have to have shared language because it becomes a game of telephone. I mean, with department chairs, if Orla presents it different than Gail, than Susan or Jess, we got a problem. So we have to kind of break back, and also teachers have to do all the work. So that's the idea of like to kind of show all three constantly meeting in that way. This is the key thing. I think it's worth, if you want, that we kind of pare down to why we're doing this work. And you could standards-based reporting, take that off. This is what we want. And this is our goal constantly that we need to be working on. Calibration is where the rubber hits the road. And the thing too is going back to those 3 science teachers that grade distribution report back in 2005, they actually gave common assessments. Every test was the same. They just scored them differently. Some gave extra credit, some gave partial credit, some graded homework. They gave the exact same practices. So they were calibrated, but not in the scoring. So that's important. And we have to remember too, people are like, well, this is so random, in that way. Partial credit is random. You give a 5, also labels. Do we count labels in math? Do we not? And then at what point do you cap it off? Well, up to 5 points off. That's random. So we have to try to de-randomize it in a systemic way. So motivation, if you haven't seen this slide, I would take a screenshot. This is great to show with parents and families about why we have to change school. So just to show what it is from 5th to 12th grade, a sample size of almost 1 million kids. What are we doing to kids in school? Blue is I've learned something interesting in the last 7 days. Green is I have fun. Red is I do what I do best every day. This is depressing, but it's real. We have to hold it up. I showed it at the incoming 6th grade parent night to try to explain this is why we need to do things a little bit differently. We know a lot more. What do you think the uptake is from junior year to senior year? Why do things get a little bit better? Light at the end of the tunnel? More specific. Any reason that kids say? Electives. I get to start to choose a little bit about what I want to do. True, right? We talk about least restrictive environment in education. High schools are the most restrictive environment. And I'm saying that with respect, okay? With full respect. We have requirements, we have systems in place. They just are though. We need to mirror that and talk about it, okay? We have to talk about our equity issue. We're hoping getting rid of any levels in 7th grade math next year. We really need to think about it. We are pigeonholing kids. We say we're not, but we are. That ties to all this work. So this is research. It's a great article. It's an abstract. The hyperlink down below. Check this out. This is important. What does the research say about student motivation? Grades do not enhance academic motivation. And I'm going to read this aloud. This is important. Given the potential for grades to thwart basic psychological needs and academic motivation, institutions should reevaluate when and in which programs grades may be appropriate or necessary. I want you to think about social emotional learning, how often we talk about that. Yet we're putting a system, the potential for grades to thwart your basic psychological needs. Think about Maslow. Why are we doing this? So we are potentially hurting kids now. Not just not helping, we're hurting kids psychologically. Not okay. So that research is really important. These are resources just to look good hyperlinks that we've added on. Millis Public Schools, we stole a lot of this from them. They've done some work interesting in their community, much smaller too to calibrate. I'm very close with the middle school principal. Millis has, each grade has about 80 kids. Easier to calibrate, so that can help move things forward. They were gonna go full boat standards reporting in 8th grade. They were asked to stop because of high school. Worried about placement. The reality is our teachers can place kids. They know the kids really well, and we may be wrong, we know that anyway. Also, overrides, parents have the legal right to override, that's okay. We have to recognize legal rights and go from there. Good images to share with staff all the time and parents as to why, what we know. Really interesting to see the trend from 2015 to 2020. Well, soon the World Economic Forum is going to give the 2025 one, what it looks like. Really interesting that creativity went from number 10 to number 3. Echoes that. Ken Robinson, everyone's seen that TED Talk. Show it again to parents. Remember, he gave that talk in 2005. I mean, let's think about that, right? Change in schools. 2022 skills outlook. This is fascinating too. Where things are, reading, writing, math, and active listening are declining. People still like to talk about the 3 R's. I'm not saying they're not important, but we have to put it in context as we go through. Another from the Economist, an article. This is one of those mirror moments early on. This is an old graph we've shown. If all these things are true, we weren't giving any formalized feedback on any of those top ones. But we say we need to do them. So how do we do it and what does it look like? This is a policy spotlight that was 2015. Massachusetts, I say this affectionately, I grew up in this, we like to do our own thing. We were way behind. Now this is a closer map to where things are now. So Massachusetts is now an emerging state, okay? So looking at that, Wyoming's the Wild West. California, remember, has a region of California that wanted to secede from the state. So just independent learning, just interesting to see context because this is a big thing from parents. What else is going on in the world as we're looking at it? This was an important white paper that came out. Colleges have done a lot of work. Remember, how are they going to get into college? Remember, homeschooled kids get into college. Private schools get into college. Who knows if Medfield's A's, we know Medfield's A's aren't even the same within each other. How can they be the same as Westwood's, Wayland's, Winchester, Lowell, Fall River? We know that, the game of school. Independent comes schools, the MASCD Transcript Consortium, check it out. This is in Singapore, they're getting rid of grades. Concord Schools, this is New Hampshire, UNH, admissions officer saying, we recognize all transcripts. This is important to share with your communities, to share that because it's that demystifying of school in that way and all that. This is the children in Singapore. Our next steps, Orla talked about that. Nathaniel Brown, awesome.
Oh, great guy.
He understands school. He's one of the experts, leading experts in assessment, works at BC at the Lynch School. This is the idea of the progress maps, that idea we need to just give step 1, step 2, step 3. That's it. What do they need to know next? Breaking down those benchmarking that we're looking at. This is that idea of green light, you're ready to move on to yellow, then red. This is the target. So in theory, if you have to kind of compromise that idea, hybrid, I actually hear the word, and I've just read it recently, don't call it a hybrid, call them parallel systems. If you have to have grades and standards based. Language. Hybrid assumes that they're connected. They're totally 2 different schools of thought. So that's something to think about. If your community or school is like, at this grade, we got to do both, I would change the word from a hybrid to a parallel. 2 different systems that are just next to each other. So I think that's important. Seth Godin, just that idea that we know about change. It takes about this is something too, to know in the medical field, it takes 17 years before a known medical practice goes into reality. So if we know that the cure for something, like this was ulcers, when they knew in the lab that this was going to cure ulcers, it wasn't until 17 years later it became practice. So we talk about, we got to move quicker. And the analogy we often talk about actually was Erin. At the time when I saw that clip and showed it with the staff, she was pregnant, about to deliver her baby. We're like, let's use Aaron's baby as an analogy. If we know this is right for kids, it will not be until Aaron's child is a senior in high school. So it's all for naught for Aaron's child. We got to move quickly as we go through. 7 essential skills, Tony Wagner. This is huge too with parents. If we think it's working, have we asked them? Right? That's the thing. Some of the parents are like, I don't know how to read it. I don't know what it means. Like, it sounds great, great philosophy. Does it work? It's like, well, I emailed the staff. Why aren't they doing it? Have we talked about it? I think Orla's right. Broken record conversations. We have to talk about it. We also are starting to do more of some of the talks we see in the research. Let's reread that article again next year. We're going to reread it differently now. We're in a different place, just like we know with kids. Thinking about that. So totally at time. This is Justin Reich, who's done a lot of work out of Harvard, ed tech teacher. Phenomenal, does a lot of online courses at MIT. What he talks about is coherence. It has nothing to do, the schools that are most effective is those that are rowing oars together. We have to be coherent. We also talk with teachers strategies of why do we have to be common. Remember as a receiving teacher how frustrating it is when kids come in and 1/3 have done this, 1/3 have done this, 1/3 have done that. It's really hard. Make it real for them. For those staff that have kids, talk about how hard it is you as a parent when you've seen your kids get in inconsistent practices. We talk to high school kids who are like, no, you need grades. How many of you in this room, we say to kids, have had a grade that you know if you had a different teacher in this school, you'd have a different grade? Every hand goes up. That's a problem that we need to openly talk about to make things better as we go through. These are just power standards things, or I'm rifling through. Is there anything to hammer home? These are things too, I would just say progression of work that we're at right now. Some resources, and I always come back to Ted Sizer. I apologize for running up the end. We're here. Any questions? Okay, thank you. Happy to share. I'll put the link up too for the slides. If you want to come visit, let us know.